everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn. So today I just realized that I used the fabric I need as a stand for my camera. Am I gonna stand up? Maybe. Today we are crooked and we are thunderstorming outside like crazy. So fingers crossed, we'll see what happens. Today we're going to talk about my top 5. I know I haven't done the top 5 Friday or what you sew on Wednesday formats in a while. I was doing good to get any content out coming up to the holidays this year. It's been bananas, and maybe we'll do a quick update. So this is January, and this is usually my downtime to work on projects that get put aside for quilting work that has a short deadline. So I'm on deadline most of the year. There's kind of a boom around late winter to early spring when everyone starts to do their spring cleaning and they get up in that attic and they're clearing out projects and they want to get things done. So there's a big boost, kind of quiets down a little bit over the summer. Maybe some dads and grads stuff comes in, like memory quilts, t-shirt quilts for graduates, college quilts, that sort of thing. And then starting in the fall, like sometimes as early as end of summer, we start seeing fall, which rolls right into Christmas themed quilts as well as Christmas gift quilts, which may not be Christmas themed. So it gets really busy sort of early spring and then the whole, at least the fourth quarter. Probably, yeah. So, you know, I'm doing good to be posting anything. So this January, I usually spend some of this time working on my patterns and getting those published. There's always a lot more new patterns in the works, and the ideas are here and they're formulated, and a lot of them are even drawn out. But the difference between a pattern that I've drawn out and a pattern that's ready to release and posted for sale and marketing on the Etsy website is a lot of work. And because it doesn't have to be done right now, I probably should carve out more time to work on patterns and get those going out. I'd like to get a pretty good library established and out there. But right now, it's a lot of deadline work. And then what else is going on this January? So I'm going to school to learn to repair my own sewing machines. That is going to be important to keep things turning and earning around the shop here. And I'll also be able to take in some outside work maintaining and repairing different sewing machines, and we'll see how that goes. I might be able to take some video footage there at the class. It depends on what they allow, what kind of updates I'll be able to do. So maybe we'll do some content at sewing machine school and let you know how that's going. But certainly when I get back, we'll talk about that. But for today, this is going to be my top 5 ways to use impossible fabrics. And we talked about the high contrast video and how to use high contrast fabrics. We talked about the low contrast video and how to use low contrast fabrics. And then you've got your large scale, multicolor hero prints. And these are the fabrics that everybody gets the most horny over. And these are the fabrics that are the hardest to use effectively in a quilt. And I know that my other videos make it sound like I hate these, and I don't hate them, but I'm a practical woman and I am not a fabric warehouse, so I only have so much room for fabric. I only have so much budget within the business to spend on fabric, and I need to be prepared for any style that could walk through the door. So a lot of these hero prints, they tell a complete story within themselves, which makes them, for one thing, really specific. So, you know, you gotta really like birds to like this particular fabric. And it's really specifically one thing, and it's really specific to like that one client who really loves it. And the more specific a fabric is, the fewer different quilts I'm able to use it in. And when you're buying wholesale, you're buying it by the bolt. So if I had a bolt of this, how many birdwatcher quilts in a year do you think I make to move a bolt of that fabric through my wares? So something that's more neutral is more applicable across more different quilts. It's more versatile. It's going to get used. I'm going to go through it faster. It's a better investment for the business. I don't just sew for my personal taste, so I can't go out to like my weirdest corners of my taste and really saturate myself in the weirdest thing that I might like, because not everybody is like me. I'm not sewing for myself as my customer. I got a lot of different customers and they have a lot of different tastes, and I'm trying to cater to them. And even when I was sewing not as a business, I was always sewing as a quilt as a gift. And so that was also not catering to my tastes personally. I had more freedom to maybe think about that person and figure out how I wanted to express what I thought would delight them, but it was more about delighting them than delighting me. Although it's a quilt, so it did delight me, let's be honest. But you know, I'm not the target market for most of this. So that being said, these are my top 5 ways to use these problematic fabrics. And I know that you have done what everyone has done, what I literally did. I have had this fabric for 15 years and I have a lot of it. And it's beautiful fabric and I do love it. But I have not found a home for it in a quilt because it's very specific. It's very difficult to use. So what are some ways that I could use this? And I want to say that for this video, all of the things that apply to a fabric that tells the whole story within itself, it has too many colors, too many saturations, too many hues, too many different things, and a large scale going on to use for any old piecing. A lot of those same rules apply to t-shirt and memory quilt fabrics. And again, when a memory quilt, it's going to be clothing, you're not necessarily pulling those fabrics specifically to accomplish a specific quilt design. It's whatever the person wore, whatever they chose. And I'm sure they weren't going through their whole life buying shirts and jeans specifically planning for a quilt outcome later in life. So it is what it is. You get what you get. And they wore their favorite shirt all the time and it was whatever color it was. You might have a lot of chaos going on because all those 20 shirts they didn't wear together at the same time. So they weren't designed to even be in a single outfit together. So a lot of these rules apply to memory quilts as well. All right, so hero prints. And the first one is to create a feature frame. And I'm gonna show a quilt from my backlog. And hopefully get the point across. So this is a memory quilt that was made for an older lady out of a lot of sweatshirts and like muumuus, if you will. And all different fabrics, all different patterns, a lot going on in each individual fabric. So instead of trying to combine them and have them fight each other, I just did them on a traditional sashed with cornerstones, and we'll show that. And you get your contrast from the sashing. And a lot of times you can find a pretty good sashing that's going to contrast everything. Medium deep gray, a black or a white, maybe like a bright color might give you enough contrast from all the shirts that you are putting a big enough chunk, like a big square. A lot of the quilt patterns that you see, like the 10-inch, you might hear them called a layer cake, but the 10-inch pre-cut squares, if you just sashed a 10-inch square and put that together in a quilt, maybe put a little cornerstone in there, it can allow some of these bigger, more complete and balanced fabrics to shine. There's nothing competing. You're not trying to create seams that make shapes that are telling the story. You're not trying to get a pinwheel to appear out of that. So that's a great way to use them. You can add a little interest with the cornerstone if you want, or not. Quilter's choice, as is everything. We have talked about putting a frame around your multicolored large scale hero print to create some shape. And this one is pretty simple, and you'll notice that this teal gives quite a bit of contrast, and this textured brown, it's like a linen material, marinate that in starch. Like starch it. I use this pressing cloth. This is for melting the glue for appliques. And then when it's close to being dry, I finish up with the iron directly on there. You don't want to burn the starch, but you want to dry it with the iron gently. So anyways, this gives a softer contrast. This gives a more crisp contrast, but from a distance, you're able to see really the shape of the outer block. The outer square is what pops to you. And because this is a soft contrast, there's a little more blending with that inner plus sign. So you kind of see a square with a dot in it at that level. And that kind of, you can look at this block that we did first, and you get a much crisper shape here and here, because you've got your high contrast setting off the block, this fabric from this fabric, and then this fabric from this fabric. So you get a very crisp sense of the shape. You see from here the square and the diamond and the outer square. So the next way to use some of these impossible fabrics that are maybe too complete and too balanced to play nicely with other fabrics, you got to remember that if every single fabric is Beyonce, you can't have 20 Beyoncés on the stage together. So you have to think of your fabrics normally as more of an orchestra. And like first flute is only doing first flute, and trombone is only doing trombone, and the guy with the big drum is only doing the big drum, and they each have their part, and together they sound good as an orchestra together. So these fabrics are more like Beyonce's, and they are divas. They are a little more challenging to use. Crooked again. How do I get crooked? So the next way is to just lean into it with a chaos quilt. And think of this like a crumb quilt or a crazy quilt you may have heard, and you can put literally anything in there. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated, what color, nothing needs to match. You don't need any specific amount of contrast. So if you have a seam and you have good contrast here and you cross over into the bird and there's no good contrast, who cares? And you can also make the pieces any size you want. So if you want to have a little bit more of this fabric appear in your chaos quilt, then you can cut the chunks slightly larger and then maybe surround them with smaller crumbs that create more of just a texture, a movement, like a buzzy beehive vibe of energy, but not really a specific shape. It's just sort of a buzz going on. So chaos quilts are great to use a lot of these fabrics that you just love, but you can't figure out how to use. The only one I did not do a sample of is the chaos quilt. And I think it's really easy to Google crazy quilt or look at any pictures of really scrappy quilts and kind of see that if you're not relying on your large scale multicolored print to create a specific shape that makes the block make sense, then it's all textured movement anyways. And what's to say you didn't have a yellow fabric and a green fabric and a yellow fabric and a blue fabric and piece together teeny tiny pieces. So it just adds to the overall movement and vibe of a scrappier, more chaotic quilt. Now you say, chaos quilt or cutting crumbs, cutting this into teeny tiny pieces, but I love this fabric and I picked it out because I love everything about it and I'm so excited about the subject matter and whatever. So the next thing to do that's gonna feature this fabric is to use it as a whole cloth. And you can use it on its own, cut a large section of it, or treat it like a panel if it's not quite big enough. And maybe you can put some simpler borders around it. But treat it like a whole cloth and just have big, huge sections and let the larger story of this fabric unfold. And you can actually piece something simple and treat it as an after quilt, which is piecing on the back. And then when you load it in the long arm, or when you actually quilt it, load this side up and then do your quilting looking at this fabric. So the quilting is more about this, and it can make your birds pop or whatever. You sort of use this large scale as the focus of your whole quilt and quilt it on the side, And then if you want to have some piecing on the back, you can do that. If you want to have a solid or textural on the back, you can do that. You can put a little border around it if you so choose. But instead of using this as a backing, use it as the top of the quilt. So for that, I lied. Don't get a fat quarter. If you're going to do that, you need a lot of yardage, depending on the size of quilt that you want. So you can make it only about that quilt. If this tells the whole story that you want to tell and it's beautiful on its own, then let it be its own thing. Make the whole quilt just that one fabric. So the next thing is to go ahead and use your large scale multis in piecing like you normally would, but literally put a frame around the piece. And that can be typically a solid color. You would use like a black or a deep gray, or depending on your print, maybe a white would give you the best contrast overall. And piece it like you normally would, but you would literally frame each piece. And so you're relying on that, let's call it sashing or like leading. If you see a stained glass quilt, it's got the thin edging around it, and it's supposed to look like the leading of the glass. So you can call that edging or leading. And you're relying on the leading fabric to give you contrast, to give you shape, to give you structure, and to create a container for that fabric. Then you can see the shapes of your piecing pop, and you're not going to run into the problems that you run into putting this fabric directly against another fabric with all the different things going on in there. And then you, next to your small leading piece, you have your background color, and you can control the amount of contrast between your leading and your background. And so you just put a container around it. And you still get to use this, because once you get inside there, let's look at the star quilt. What goes on inside that star, nobody cares and doesn't matter. It's still going to look like a star because that outer band is high contrast. It's largely solids, and it creates a really strong graphic contrast from the white backing. So I could have put this fabric in the middle. I could have put any number of chaotic things in the middle, and that outer band of solid dark is going to create an edge, create a container, and give my mind some order and some structure. And then I can fill it up with whatever wildness I want to fill it up with. Basically, the long story short is you need to get a hold of that boundary and create definition at the boundary. So our next block, also not fussy cut, is this is what I was talking about, like the stained glass quilts. They put the leading, the thin strips. This could be much thinner. If you wanted to de-emphasize this asterisk shape, you could do just either this or this would also create some definition. So your eye goes to the contrast created by the solid, and you're able to use this fabric, but you're not leaning on it as your source of contrast. So I'm getting a boundary and I'm getting a shape here by adding this contrasting fabric. And you could do less, you could do more, you could put this teal color all the way around, whatever works in your pattern. But from a distance, even though this is not a high contrast fabric, large scale multi, I am able to get this to read as a pinwheel because I've made the shape here and I've created the contrast between these two fabrics. Okay, so what did we do? We talked about whole cloth, chaos quilt, fancy frames, edging, and then the last thing that's a great way to use these big hero fabrics that have way too much going on is to fussy cut. So you could go in and take just this bird and use that for applique. Use that to feature in the center of a 3-level grandmother's economy block. And that is a great way to use these fabrics, is to just trim just the part that you want. And then you don't run into the problem of, well, it's light and it's dark and it's red and it's yellow, because you're just cutting the part that you want. So you're just cutting the red. You're just cutting the blue. And so you're sort of editing this down to a unit that's more usable in your quilt, and that's going to pop where you're going to put that. So if it's going to go onto a background of white, if it's going to go in the middle of a block and you're going to frame that out with another color, you're sort of narrowing it down so you know what it is, so you can find the opposite, so you can contrast it. So I chose a very simple fabric. I went all the way to a solid. And because this background, there's a lot of it and it's a lighter color, I went with a darker color. And that is going to, this edge is a little soft. But what this does is create a boundary around it that's easy to contrast. And then I was able to find a contrasting fabric. So I did this double Grandmother's Economy block. And remember, if you do a single Grandmother's Economy, so say I stopped at the teal, then whatever you cut for the center has to be on point. And then when you add the next layer, it makes your block come out as a square in the center. And each time you add a layer, it does that. If you have an odd number of rings around the rosy, then your center block needs to be on a diamond. And if you have an even number of rings around, then your center block is on a square. So you know how to cut that pattern if it's directional. All right, so that's one example. I have not fussy cut, and I am using a pattern that needs the geometry to make sense, but here I've created and controlled the boundary with this solid fabric, and then now I have an easy contrast to make here. So from a distance, I can see the shape of the block. So there's one. So I've done an applique block here, very simple, but I selected my edge where I was cutting based on keeping this color palette simple so that I have fewer things that I have to contrast against. So now I can select one fabric that contrasts this boundary and it doesn't have to contrast the whole thing. Now I was using scrap for this, so could I have centered this bird up a little better? Could I have made the shape a little different? I'm sure I could. I could have done a little scallop there, any number of things. But I was just doing a quick example. As you are cutting, you're fussy cutting this boundary to limit the number of colors and hues and textures that are going on where this fabric meets this fabric. And then again, from a distance, you can see the shape of the applique. And that's it. Those are my top 5 ways to use impossible fabrics. I'm going to try to put a good slideshow of some examples. And if I don't have them, maybe we'll do some projects and some follow-up videos showing how to use those fabrics. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video from Longarming by Jaclyn, and have a great day. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.